Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you're part of our journey. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and get ready for a story that will leave you thinking. And if you love inspiring tales, a like goes a long way. Someone like you doesn't belong here. The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable dripping with contempt. The young billionaire's voice carried across the restaurant's VIP section, deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. Around them, conversations faltered as heads turned toward the elderly man in the worn tweed jacket who sat alone, menu trembling slightly in his weathered hands. The old teacher had saved for months for this dinner, a small, rare indulgence after 40 years of shaping young minds on a pension that barely covered his modest apartment. The restaurant's soft lighting reflected off polished silverware as waitstaff moved with practiced elegance between tables. He had calculated exactly what he could afford, just one entree and perhaps a cup of tea. The manager hovered uncertainly, caught between the elderly patron and the young tech mogul, whose parties regularly dropped thousands at his establishment. The billionaire's laughter grew louder as he continued his public humiliation. What no one noticed was the man sitting 3 tables away, baseball cap pulled low, who had stopped mid-conversation with his companion, his attention now fully focused on the unfolding scene. If this moment made you feel something, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button and stay with us. Subscribe now. Professor James Wilson had taught literature for 43 years at Westfield High School. Generations of students had passed through his classroom, many going on to prestigious universities, inspired by his passion for words and stories. Tonight was the 50th anniversary of his first date with his late wife, Eleanor, who had passed 3 years ago. They had always dreamed of dining at Lumiere, the city's most exclusive restaurant, but never could afford it on their modest salaries. After Eleanor's passing, James had set aside a small portion of his pension each month, determined to honor their dream. The billionaire, Carter Sterling, had made his fortune in tech startups before his 30th birthday. His face regularly appeared on financial magazines, always with that same smirk that suggested the world existed for his amusement. Tonight, surrounded by his entourage of yes men and Instagram models, he was performing, turning an old man's dignity into entertainment. His designer suit probably cost more than James's yearly pension, his watch worth more than the teacher's car. "I'm sorry, sir," the manager whispered to James, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. "Perhaps another establishment might be more suitable for your budget." His eyes darted nervously toward Sterling's table, where the young billionaire was now mimicking James's careful study of the menu. James's hands trembled more visibly now, not from age, but from humiliation. Around the restaurant, other diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some pretended not to notice, studying their menus with sudden intensity. Others whispered behind manicured hands, their eyes darting between the elderly teacher and the boisterous billionaire. A few wore expressions of genuine discomfort, perhaps remembering their own grandparents or favorite teachers. "Look at him counting pennies." Sterling's voice cut through the elegant piano music. "This isn't a soup kitchen, old man. There's a perfectly good diner down the street, more your class." His companions laughed on cue, the sound hollow and performative. One woman in a red dress touched Sterling's arm, whispering something that might have been an objection, but he shook her off, clearly enjoying his moment. The manager placed a hand on James's shoulder. "Sir, I must ask you to," he began, but stopped as James slowly rose from his chair, dignity intact despite the public humiliation. The old teacher's face was flushed, a lifetime of self-respect warring with the shame of the moment. His worn shoes squeaked slightly on the polished marble floor as he gathered his coat, the sound somehow more noticeable than all of Sterling's loud proclamations. 3 tables away, the man in the baseball cap slowly set down his water glass. His companion, a sleek Hollywood agent in an expensive suit, was mid-sentence about a potential environmental documentary when he noticed his client was no longer listening. Under the shadow of the cap's brim, Leonardo DiCaprio's eyes had narrowed, watching the scene with increasing intensity. He had come to Lumiere seeking privacy, a rare evening away from cameras and recognition. The baseball cap and corner table usually afforded him the anonymity he craved. Tonight, however, something more important than privacy was at stake. DiCaprio had grown up with respect for educators. His own mother had been a teacher before his acting career took off. He had built his later career advocating for those without a voice, fighting against the very privilege and entitlement he now witnessed. His jaw tightened as Sterling's mockery continued, watching as the elderly teacher stood with quiet dignity against the billionaire's barrage. "Leo," his agent whispered, recognizing the look on his client's face. "Don't get involved. There are photographers outside." But DiCaprio was already calculating his approach, mentally setting aside the scripts and proposals that had been the evening's intended focus. His posture had changed, the casual slouch of anonymity transforming into something more purposeful. As James Wilson slowly made his way toward the door, head held high despite his humiliation, Leonardo DiCaprio made his decision. Things are about to take a turn. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe, like our video, and keep watching. "Sir," DiCaprio called, his voice instantly recognizable despite his attempts at anonymity. The restaurant fell into a hushed silence, the kind that happens when celebrity presence is suddenly revealed. James paused, turning with the natural respect of someone acknowledged. Sterling's laughter cut off abruptly, his eyes widening with recognition. The billionaire straightened his designer tie, already calculating the networking opportunity. Leonardo stood, removing his cap as he approached the elderly teacher. The restaurant's warm lighting caught the familiar features that had graced countless screens. Several diners reached instinctively for phones, but DiCaprio's focused intensity made them hesitate. This wasn't a moment for selfies or social media. The actor extended his hand to James. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby tables. "Would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner?" The question hung in the air, simple, yet profound. James blinked in confusion, not immediately recognizing the international star standing before him. He saw only kindness in the younger man's eyes, a genuine respect that contrasted sharply with Sterling's mockery. "I wouldn't want to impose," James replied with the dignity of his profession. DiCaprio smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes in a way rarely captured in paparazzi shots. "The imposition would be mine," he insisted. "I'd be grateful for your company." His hand remained extended, a bridge across generations and social divides. Around them, the restaurant had become utterly silent, the drama unfolding more compelling than any Hollywood script. Sterling's face flushed crimson, the public power shift unmistakable. The attention of the room had transferred completely from his performance to the actor and teacher. One of Sterling's companions whispered urgently in his ear, likely explaining who exactly was intervening. Not just an A-list celebrity, but a man known for environmental activism and philanthropy. A man whose net worth dwarfed even Sterling's considerable fortune. "Mr. DiCaprio," Sterling called, pushing back his chair. "Why don't you both join us? I'm sure we can make room." His voice had transformed, the contempt replaced by an obsequious charm. The Instagram models at his table were already angling for better positions, recognizing the social media potential. Sterling gestured expansively at his table. "The champagne is excellent." DiCaprio didn't even glance in Sterling's direction. His focus remained entirely on James, who stood hesitating, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. "My friend and I have business to discuss," DiCaprio replied, still looking at James. "Professor, would you mind helping us settle a debate about American literature? I've been arguing with my agent all evening." The manager, who had been frozen in place, suddenly sprang into action. "Of course, Mr. DiCaprio. We'll prepare a larger table immediately." His earlier reluctance had vanished, replaced by eager accommodation. James watched this transformation with the quiet observation of someone who had taught human nature for decades. DiCaprio noticed the subtle shift in the older man's expression. Not judgment, just recognition of the world's inconsistencies. As the manager led them to a premium corner table, better than DiCaprio's previous seating and far superior to where James had been placed, whispers rippled through the restaurant. Phones emerged discreetly, capturing the moment. By morning, the scene would be spreading across social media platforms, examined and dissected by millions. Sterling remained standing at his table. The center of attention suddenly shifted away from him, his performance without an audience. "I'm James Wilson," the teacher said as they settled at the new table. "I taught literature at Westfield High for over 40 years." His hands had stopped trembling, dignity returning to his posture. DiCaprio's agent, recovering from his surprise, introduced himself and immediately engaged the professor in conversation about Fitzgerald, whose works were being considered for a new adaptation. "The Great Gatsby," James smiled, warming to the familiar subject. "I taught that book every year to my seniors." His eyes brightened with the passion of his profession, the illusion of the American dream, the corruption of wealth without purpose. He spoke with the practiced eloquence of someone who had spent a lifetime illuminating young minds, seemingly forgetting the humiliation of moments earlier. DiCaprio leaned forward, genuinely interested. "That's exactly what attracted me to the role," he said. "The emptiness behind Gatsby's wealth, the yearning for something more meaningful." As they spoke, a waiter arrived with menus. Not the abbreviated versions James had been given earlier, but the full leather-bound presentations with no prices listed. The teacher's eyes widened slightly as he realized what this meant. DiCaprio noticed and smiled slightly. "Please," he said quietly, "order whatever you were planning to. This dinner is clearly important to you. This story is only getting deeper. What would you do in this situation? Comment below, and let's talk." Throughout the meal, James gradually revealed the reason for his visit, the anniversary he was honoring, the promise to Eleanor. DiCaprio listened intently, his celebrity persona completely set aside. Other diners watched the unlikely trio, the contrast striking, the weathered teacher in his decades-old suit, the casually dressed global superstar, and the polished Hollywood agent. Their conversation flowed naturally from literature to life, bridging generations and experiences. From his table, Sterling continued to watch, his expression darkening as he recognized the lost opportunity. Twice he sent over bottles of expensive champagne, which DiCaprio politely declined. The third time, Sterling himself approached their table, wine glass in hand, his smile fixed and artificial. "I must apologize for our misunderstanding earlier," he said, addressing James while looking at DiCaprio. "I had no idea you were acquainted with Leo." The familiarity of the nickname hung awkwardly in the air. James looked up at the young billionaire, his expression neither angry nor intimidated. Behind Sterling, his entourage watched expectantly, phones ready to capture any interaction with the film star. DiCaprio set down his fork and turned to face Sterling fully for the first time. The restaurant quieted again, conversations pausing as diners sensed another scene unfolding. "We weren't previously acquainted," DiCaprio said, his voice level but carrying. "We just met tonight." He paused, letting the implication settle. "But I'm honored to dine with someone who's dedicated his life to educating generations of students." Sterling's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, education is incredibly important. My foundation actually donates substantial sums to—" "Mr. Sterling," DiCaprio interrupted gently, "do you know what Professor Wilson was just telling me?" He didn't wait for an answer. He was sharing how he spent 43 years teaching young people about empathy through literature. How books like To Kill a Mockingbird and The Great Gatsby can help us understand the human condition beyond our own experiences. James watched this exchange with the patient observation of a seasoned teacher. DiCaprio continued. He was explaining how Fitzgerald showed us that wealth without character is meaningless, that true worth isn't measured by bank accounts or social status. His eyes never left Sterling's increasingly uncomfortable face. I found it fascinating, especially tonight. The restaurant had become absolutely silent. Waitstaff paused mid-step, guests forgot their meals. Sterling shifted his weight, suddenly aware that he was cast as Fitzgerald's Tom Buchanan in this public morality play, wealthy, entitled, and ultimately empty. His companions at the other table were no longer filming. Phones had been quietly lowered as the uncomfortable truth of the moment settled over the room. "Professor Wilson taught thousands of students over his career," DiCaprio said, his voice taking on the quality that had delivered Oscar-worthy monologues. "He shaped minds, built futures, created citizens. Tell me, what exactly is the nature of your contribution, Mr. Sterling?" "I provide jobs," Sterling replied defensively, his earlier charm evaporating. "My companies employ hundreds of people." James, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "One of my former students works for you," he said quietly. "Michael Patel. Brilliant mind. He speaks highly of your innovation, but mentioned that employee turnover is significant." The gentle observation landed with surprising weight. Several diners exchanged glances. Sterling Tech's aggressive corporate culture was well known in industry circles. Sterling's face flushed again, but before he could respond, DiCaprio stood up. At just over 6 feet, he wasn't particularly imposing physically, but his presence filled the space with an authority earned through decades in the public eye. "The beauty of places like this," he said, gesturing around the restaurant, "is that they can bring together people from all walks of life. A place where success should be measured by character, not credit limits." He turned to the other diners, now openly watching. "I've been fortunate in my career, very fortunate. But I know that my wealth doesn't make me better than anyone else in this room, or outside it." His eyes returned to Sterling. "It certainly doesn't give me the right to diminish someone else's dignity." The young billionaire stood frozen, caught in a moment he couldn't control with money or status. Around the restaurant, expressions had changed from entertainment to something more reflective. A few older patrons nodded in agreement. One woman was quietly wiping a tear. The manager, watching from near the kitchen doors, looked both mortified and moved. "It's not over yet. The best part is coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it." Sterling returned to his table without another word, his entourage suddenly subdued. Several of his companions made quiet excuses and left shortly after. The restaurant gradually returned to its normal atmosphere, though conversations now carried a different tone, more thoughtful, less performative. Servers approached James with a deference equal to what they showed DiCaprio, the earlier dismissiveness completely erased. "You didn't need to do that," James said quietly when they were alone again. DiCaprio shook his head. "Actually, I did. We all did. He gestured subtly around the restaurant. Places like this, they can become echo chambers of privilege. Sometimes we need reminding of what really matters. His agent nodded in agreement, his initial reluctance about the public scene now replaced with evident respect. As they finished their meal, the restaurant's executive chef emerged personally, asking to meet James. "My father was a teacher in Boston," he explained, emotion evident in his voice. "Everything I am, I owe to educators like him. Like you." He insisted on preparing a special dessert in honor of James's anniversary, a delicate creation that wasn't on the menu. "Eleanor would have loved this," James whispered as it was presented, the first time his composure faltered all evening. Several other diners stopped by their table before leaving, quietly sharing their own stories of influential teachers. A distinguished older woman in expensive jewelry clasped James's hand. "You taught my daughter Sarah in 2003, she said. "She's a published author now because of you." When the bill came, DiCaprio insisted on paying despite James's polite objections. "Consider it an investment in education," he said with a smile. As they prepared to leave, the manager approached with renewed deference. "Professor Wilson, Mr. DiCaprio," he said. "We would be honored to have you both return any time." He handed James a card with his personal number written on the back. "No reservations needed." Outside, several paparazzi had gathered, alerted by social media to DiCaprio's presence. Camera flashes lit up the night as they exited. James instinctively stepped back, but DiCaprio placed a hand on his shoulder. "Professor Wilson," he said clearly, ensuring the photographers could hear, "thank you for sharing your wisdom tonight. It was truly an honor." The photos appeared online within minutes. By morning, they would be featured on entertainment sites worldwide, not because of DiCaprio's casual attire or his latest project, but because of the story that accompanied them. Respect Teachers began trending as the narrative spread, accompanied by personal stories of educators who had changed lives. Sterling's table had emptied while they finished their meal, the billionaire departing without fanfare. His social media accounts, usually active hourly, remained silent for 3 days afterward. When he re-emerged online, it was with an announcement of a new scholarship fund for underprivileged students, dedicated to the unsung heroes of education. The comment section filled with knowing references to the DiCaprio effect. DiCaprio's car service arrived, but before parting, he exchanged contact information with James. "I meant what I said about American literature," he explained. "I'd value your perspective on some scripts I'm considering." James nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the evening's events. "Eleanor would have loved this story," he said with a gentle smile. 3 weeks later, Westfield High School received an unexpected donation, a completely renovated library and technology center, with a plaque dedicating it to Professor James Wilson and generations of educators who build our future one mind at a time. The funding came from an anonymous source, though students quickly connected it to the viral restaurant story involving their former teacher and the famous actor. James returned to Lumiere 6 months later, on what would have been his wedding anniversary. He was immediately shown to a prime table, where a single rose waited in a vase, arranged by standing instructions from DiCaprio's office. As he settled in, an elderly couple at the next table recognized him from the story that had circulated months before. "You're the teacher," the woman said warmly. "Our granddaughter showed us the story online. She's studying to become a teacher because of people like you." James smiled and thanked her. As he glanced around the restaurant, he noticed something had changed since his last visit. Among the well-dressed patrons were people who might once have felt out of place here. A young student with a scholarship certificate, an elderly couple clearly celebrating a special occasion, a family whose attire suggested this was a rare splurge. The manager caught his eye and nodded subtly. The invisible barriers of class hadn't disappeared entirely. They never do. But they had shifted, just enough to matter. Just enough to remind everyone that true worth isn't found in a bank account or social status, but in the dignity with which we treat each other. Wow, what a story. If this moved you, imagine what else we have for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and let us know what you think.